approaching.
Approaching 19.
Bare metal, 4 engines under swept wings. A shape that could pass for an early passenger jet until you see the rigid steel pipe folded flat beneath the tail. The data plate on the nose reads somewhere between 1957 and 1965. This is a KC-135 Stratotanker. Every stealth fighter, every bomber, every strike package the United States sends beyond its own borders runs out of fuel long before it runs out of mission. The Air Force has around 400 of these to fix that, and they are roughly 80% of its entire tanker fleet, which makes an airframe older than almost everyone watching, the load-bearing wall under American air power. And nobody ever decided how long it was allowed to last. Every aircraft contract carries a design service life, the hours the airframe must survive before the metal gives up. When the Air Force committed to 250 of these tankers in 1954, that line went in empty. 8 years on, the Pentagon still had no answer, so in 1962 they stopped asking engineers and asked the aircraft. A full airframe went into a test rig and was bent the way flight bends a wing, until it cracked. The Air Force is planning missions for these into the 2050s, 100 years of service, give or take. Today, we decode why, what this thing moves, the 3 ways it hands that fuel over, and the appointment that makes any of it matter. Pulling machines like this apart is what we do on Classified Decoded. Subscribe and let's read the sky together. Because before you can call an aircraft too old to fly, you have to know what a tanker is graded on. Almost nobody in this argument does. In air combat, everything is the energy state. Altitude is savings, speed is cash, and you can never print more of either. A tanker is the only thing in the whole system that carries energy for somebody else. Without one, an F-35's reach is a circle 600 or 700 nautical miles wide, far too small for the map it is expected to cross. Which is why the arithmetic has turned uncomfortable. In September 2024, the Air Force retired the KC-10 extender, the heaviest offloader it owned. Its replacement, the KC-46 Pegasus, passed 100 airframes delivered, with the program still uncertified, and the vision system its boom operators work through slipped from a promised 2024 to 2028. So Congress raised the legal floor on the tanker fleet and blocked KC-135 retirements outright. The easy explanation is sitting right there. The old machine still flies because the new one is late. That is true, and it answers the wrong question. It explains why the KC-135 was never retired and says nothing about whether it is worth flying. So, what is a tanker graded on? We judge machines by the year they were born because that is the easiest number on the form to read. Before we call this thing old, go find its actual report card. The first entry on that card is about company. A tanker has to be able to live in the same air as the thing it feeds. Its predecessor could not. The KC-97 ran on piston engines and cruised around 200 knots. To take fuel from it, a B-52 had to come down, drop flaps, and hang near the edge of a stall. And even then, both aircraft had to push into a shallow dive so gravity could buy the tanker the speed its engines could not. 2 machines descending in formation, trading fuel on the way down because they could not agree on an energy state. The KC-135 deleted that with geometry. Wings swept 35 degrees back to hold off the shock waves that build near the speed of sound, and a cruise of 460 knots. Nothing left to negotiate. Fuel in the wings feeds the engines. That share belongs to the aircraft. Everything under the cabin floor exists to be given away. The pumps can reach every drop but the last 1,000 gallons, held back so the tanker can always get itself home. And what is left for everybody else comes to 200,000 pounds. Set that against a maximum takeoff weight of 320,000. At its heaviest, most of this machine is not aircraft. It is somebody else's fuel. And it can put 150,000 pounds of it into other aircraft 1,300 nautical miles from where it started. None of those numbers belong to the airplane that rolled out in 1957. The original had 4 J-57 turbojets that could not lift it at full load without water sprayed into them on takeoff, trailing black smoke until the water ran out 3 minutes later. Today it flies on F-108 turbofans, the military CF-M56, with close to double the thrust and 50% more offload. The machine in the sky right now is not a faded version of the 1957 aircraft. It is twice the aircraft. There is one limit the airframe does not set. A standard crew is capped at 16 hours, and the Pacific does not care. So, 1 October, the 92nd Air Refueling Wing at Fairchild ran 2 KC-135s continuously for 72 hours, landing only to swap crews, with at least one engine turning the whole time. The old record was 40 hours. The machine never needed the brake, the people did. Getting the fuel to the right coordinate is one part of the problem. Getting it out of one airplane and into another, in close formation at nearly 500 knots, is a different one, and the world has never agreed on how. The argument is over who holds the connection. Either the tanker reaches out and makes it, or the receiver flies up and takes it. And this airframe was eventually rebuilt to do both, 3 separate ways. The first is the flying boom, the Air Force's answer. That pipe under the tail, 28 feet folded and telescoping out to 48, with 2 small V-shaped surfaces near the nozzle called rudder vaders that make lift and drag in the airflow, which turns the boom from a hose into a small aircraft. And somebody has to fly it. That somebody drops through a hole in the cabin floor into a pod in the belly of the tail, stretches out face down on a pallet with the sky running past underneath, and looks aft through a window at another airplane holding station a few dozen feet behind, bucking in the wash coming off the tail they are lying in. The receiver pilot cannot see their own receptacle or judge the closure by eye, so they fly on light, the pilot director lights, 2 panels on the tanker's belly driven by sensors inside the boom's own mechanism, reporting its geometry straight into the other cockpit. The payoff is flow, 1,100 gallons a minute, which is what a bomber needs. The cost is that it only fits aircraft with a receptacle in the spine, the Air Force plus allies flying American airframes. It leaves out the Navy, the Marines, most European types, and every helicopter ever made. Those fly probe and drogue instead, and a probe needs something soft to plug into. The first fix was crude, and they called it the boom drogue adapter. Bolt 9 feet of steel-braided hose onto the boom nozzle with a hard basket on the end, and a probe-equipped aircraft can connect. It works, and it costs the tanker its boom for the whole flight, switching sides rather than adding an option. Worse, there is no reel to take up slack when the receiver drifts forward, so the safe disconnect window is narrow, and one hose serves one customer at a time. The real answer came later. 20 KC-135 RS carry Mark 32B pods under the outer wings, each with a real hose reel that pays out a basket and takes the slack back in. 2 hoses, 2 receivers at once. And because the pods hang from the wings, the boom is untouched. The aircraft can refuel by boom and by drogue on the same mission. The bolt-on hose forced a choice. The pods deleted the question. Each hose runs at well under half the boom's rate, but total throughput barely moves while connections double. And the receiving end decides anyway. An F-16 can swallow nearly everything a boom can push, while an F-35 takes about a third of that. Push hard against a receiver that cannot drink it, and most of the flow advantage goes unused. All of it is worth nothing until 2 machines find each other in an empty sky. A refueling mission starts hours before either aircraft leaves the ground. Both crews are handed the same coordinate and the same second. Not a suggestion to meet up, an appointment. And an entire strike package is planned backwards from it. A lateral error puts you in the wrong place. A vertical error puts you in the same one. So the rendezvous is given 1,000 feet of altitude to itself, and the receiver comes up from underneath it. Then the sky changes hands. As they converge, the tanker declares MARSA. Military assumes responsibility for separation of aircraft, and civil control stops keeping these two apart. From that call on, the crews own it. The tanker turns to roll out in front because the larger machine maneuvers so the smaller one can fly straight. The receiver slides up to 50 feet behind and below and stops. Not slows, stops. Both aircraft at cruise speed and 0 knots relative to each other. From here, the conversation is light. Colored bands run the length of the boom, and after dark ultraviolet lamps make them burn without blinding the pilot reading them. Those lamps emit in the infrared now, so the whole appointment can be kept in the dark, in silence, under night vision. The last 50 feet close at about a foot per second. 2 aircraft tearing through 800 feet of air every second, and creeping toward each other at 1. Then the latches bite, a signal coil flips from open to good, and the pumps open. And there is a plan for the second it goes wrong. Either the boom operator or the receiver pilot calls it, breakaway, 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 and nobody has to think. The tanker slams to full power and climbs to the top of that 1,000-foot block. The receiver pulls to idle and pushes down to the bottom. 2 opposite trajectories, inside a space set aside for this exact emergency before anyone left the ground. Does it hold? Twice, 34 years apart. Across Desert Storm, the tanker force flew more than 51,000 refuelings and made every scheduled wartime rendezvous. Then, Operation Midnight Hammer, June 2025. 7 B-2s, 37 hours non-stop from Missouri, inside a package of more than 125 aircraft, with 30 tankers positioned in advance. A flight like that exists only if every appointment on it is kept. Both times, the appointment held. Which makes the argument running about this aircraft a strange one to be having. In what sense can a tanker be obsolete at all? A fighter can be beaten by a better radar or a longer-ranged missile. It is graded on what it brings to the fight. A tanker force sells something else, a guaranteed connection, this many pounds at that coordinate at that second. That is arithmetic and procedure, and neither contains a term for year of manufacture. So go back to the numbers we started with. We read them as impressive for the aircraft's age. On the real report card, age was never in the equation at all. And the choreography we watched as a procedure the crews memorize turns out to be the product itself. A tanker force's real inventory is measured in connections, how many it can guarantee in a day, at coordinates agreed hours in advance, by crews running a handful of moves that have been rehearsed continuously since before the oldest of these airframes left the factory. The calendar reads 70 years of that as wear. On the report card, it is compound interest. Then ask the metal. This wing never had margin to spare. The 7178 T6 aluminum chosen for the lower skin to save weight and carry more fuel became the root cause of the type's earliest fatigue cracking, cracks that have been cut out and reskinned ever since. 600 pounds saved bought more than 30% more stress. What kept it alive was the way it was used. Strategic Air Command spent the Cold War holding these machines on nuclear alert far more than flying them, and metal counts bending cycles rather than birthdays. Run that arithmetic and the structure walks past the year 2100. This aircraft survived on what it never had to do. The crisis, then, lives in the force rather than in any airframe. What is actually shrinking is the total pounds the United States can guarantee in a day, and that number lost its heaviest contributor in 2024. Every KC-135 has stopped being an old aircraft awaiting retirement. It is a constant, holding a total above a line. Then the bill arrives. Fatigue can be banked. Parked on a ramp, the airframe spends nothing. Corrosion cannot. Chemistry runs on the calendar whether the aircraft flies or not, and the structural arithmetic everyone quotes leaves it out. Every year the replacement slips is paid for in the one currency this airframe cannot save. The machine is also large, slow, and tied to a published orbit, but that is a question about where the appointment is held, not how old it is. So the Air Force is not flying a tanker this old out of sentiment. It is flying it on a number nobody chose. That gap between what a machine is actually scored on and what we assume it is scored on is the whole work here on Classified Decoded. Subscribe, and the date on a data plate becomes the last number you check. When that wing in the test rig finally cracked, it had gone something like 55,000 flight hours. Discovered, not specified. Then the Cold War stacked a second accident on the first. An aircraft bought to sit on nuclear alert spent decades not flying, and quietly kept most of the life it was never asked to spend. Every program since has done it properly. Service life, specified. Airframe hours, contracted. Retirement date, on the chart. And every one of them has arrived at exactly the number it was given, and gone no further. So sit with the uncomfortable version of that. A machine nobody set a limit for is outliving the machines we designed limits into. When we hand an engineer the exact number of hours a design must survive, are we writing a floor or quietly building a ceiling? Because some machines outlive their own replacements, and a few of them do it because nobody ever told them when to stop.